The journey to the moon, a singular event in the annals of human history, remains a subject of intense fascination and, for some, profound skepticism. Decades after the last boot print was left in the lunar dust, a persistent shadow of doubt fuels a universe of conspiracy theories, narratives that whisper of a grand deception, suggesting that humanity's greatest voyage never actually left the confines of a terrestrial film set. Some of these claims verge on the patently absurd, easily dismissed with a cursory understanding of physics. Yet, others are constructed with such intricate detail that they manage to plant a seed of reasonable doubt, giving rise to an even more unsettling hypothesis. Perhaps humanity did reach the moon, but what it discovered there was so profoundly unexpected, so woke, that the true story had to be buried beneath a carefully crafted fiction. Internet, a fertile ground for such alternative histories, has for years hosted a thriving ecosystem of arguments against the official narrative. There is the persistent question of the American flag, which appeared to flutter in the windless vacuum of space. There are detailed analyses of the astronauts' footprints, supposedly too clear for a dry, lifeless world. Critics point to the official photographs, noting the conspicuous absence of stars in the inky black sky, and they question the landing sites themselves, wondering why the powerful descent engine of the lunar module failed to excavate a visible blast crater in the soft surface below. While many of these assertions can be systematically deconstructed by scientific principles, they collectively contribute to a lingering sense of uncertainty. To truly grapple with these questions, one must first appreciate the staggering scale and complexity of the endeavor known as the Apollo program. This was not a single, isolated mission, but a colossal national effort, born from the crucible of the Cold War, that spanned more than a decade. The official record documents 17 distinct Apollo missions, a number that swells to 20 in more speculative accounts. This monumental program was a methodical, step-by-step conquest of space, beginning with uncrewed tests and culminating in the missions that would define an era. Of these, only a select few from Apollo 11 to Apollo 17, with the notable exception of the perilous Apollo 13, achieved the ultimate goal of landing humans on the lunar surface. The saga of Apollo 13 itself stands as a testament to the immense dangers involved. A mission that shared the same ambitious objective but was thwarted by a catastrophic in-flight emergency, transforming a lunar landing into a desperate, nail-biting struggle for survival and a heroic return to Earth. In total, just 12 human beings have experienced the profound privilege of walking upon the soil of another world. Over the course of 6 successful landings, these astronauts conducted a series of carefully planned extravehicular activities. They traversed the alien terrain in a specially designed electric rover, a marvel of compact engineering. They documented their surroundings with high-resolution photography, capturing images that would become iconic symbols of human achievement. They meticulously collected samples, bringing back approximately 382 kilograms of 840 pounds of lunar rocks, core samples, and fine-grained dust. Treasures that would unlock secrets about the moon's origin and the early history of our solar system. Beyond exploration and collection, they deployed sophisticated scientific experiments and left behind an array of man-made objects. Each landing site became an unintentional monument, a silent testament to human presence. The descent stage of each lunar module, the vehicle that carried them to the surface, remains exactly where it landed. These hulking artifacts, along with the discarded lunar rovers, now sit as relics in the most pristine museum imaginable. The astronauts also deployed scientific stations, leaving behind seismographs to detect moon and laser retroreflexors, mirrored arrays that are still used by observatories on Earth to this day. By bouncing laser beams off these mirrors, scientists can measure the Earth-Moon distance with millimeter precision, providing invaluable data for testing Einstein's theory of general relativity. For decades, the only proof of these artifacts was the testimony of the men who left them there. However, in recent years, a new chapter of verification has opened: high-resolution orbital photography from modern lunar probes, including NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and China's Change spacecraft, has provided undeniable visual evidence. These images clearly show the landing modules, the rovers, and even the faint tracks left by the astronauts' boots, lines etched into the surface that have remained undisturbed for half a century. The evidence is clear. Humanity's artifacts are indeed resting on the moon. The financial cost of this monumental undertaking was, by any measure, astonishing, a reflection of the national will required to achieve such a goal. The program's legacy, however, is measured not just in dollars, but in the scientific knowledge gained and the indelible mark left on the human spirit. The final financial accounting for the Apollo program reveals a figure of staggering proportions for its time, an estimated $26 billion. To truly comprehend the scale of this investment, one must place it within the economic landscape of the 1960s. For context, consider the pinnacle of naval engineering from that era, a USC Forrestal-class aircraft carrier. These colossal floating air bases, symbols of American military might, each costs approximately $450 million to construct. A simple calculation reveals the breathtaking truth. The funds allocated to reach the moon could have financed the construction of an entire fleet of nearly 60 such aircraft carriers. Even the most advanced and expensive military aircraft of the day were rendered fiscally insignificant by comparison. Never before in the history of the United States government had such a colossal sum been channeled into a single, non-military objective. When adjusted for modern inflation, this expenditure balloons into a figure somewhere between $175 and $200 billion, a sum that rivals the gross domestic product of many contemporary nations. This immense financial commitment was mirrored by an equally unprecedented mobilization of human capital. It is estimated that over the course of the program, a sprawling network of approximately 400,000 individuals contributed their expertise. This was a national effort on an industrial scale, drawing in physicists, mathematicians, engineers, technicians, and administrators from every corner of the country. They were the mission controllers in Houston, hunched over consoles in smoke-filled rooms. The seamstresses in Delaware, meticulously hand-stitching the 21 layers of fabric for a single spacesuit. The rocket scientists at Cape Canaveral, wrestling with the immense power of the Saturn V. All were cogs in a vast and complex machine, all singularly focused on landing a human being on the lunar surface. This monumental undertaking did not occur in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of the Cold War, a period of intense ideological and geopolitical friction between two global superpowers. On one side stood the United States and its allies. On the other, the Soviet Union and its bloc of communist nations. This was a rivalry that extended far beyond terrestrial borders, playing out in proxy wars, espionage, and a frantic technological arms race. The competition for supremacy found its most dramatic stage in the cosmos. The conquest of space, and specifically the moon, became a proxy for ideological victory. For the scientists involved, the pursuit was noble a quest for knowledge and the expansion of human understanding. Yet, for the politicians and strategists orchestrating the endeavor, the motivations were far more pragmatic. Reaching the moon was not merely a scientific milestone. It was a definitive political statement, an unambiguous demonstration of technological and systemic superiority over their Soviet rivals. The stakes were incredibly high, and for a time, it appeared the Americans were losing. The Soviets had achieved a series of shocking firsts, sending the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. And most significantly, launching the first human, Yuri Gagarin. Each Soviet triumph sent tremors of anxiety through the American establishment, but the ultimate prize remained the moon, and it was here that America focused its vast resources. In July of 1969, that investment paid its ultimate dividend as the world watched, mesmerized by grainy television images, as American astronauts took the first steps onto another world. And yet, this golden age of lunar exploration proved to be astonishingly brief. The final mission, Apollo 17, lifted off on December 7, 1972, and its crew departed the lunar surface on December 14th. The entire period of human visitation to the moon, from the first landing to the last, spanned less than 3.5 years. An endeavor of such monumental cost and effort, a project that had redefined the limits of human achievement, was abandoned after a fleeting moment of triumph. This abrupt cessation raises a profound and persistent question that echoes through the decades. Why did humanity stop going? After proving it was possible, after building the infrastructure and developing the technology at such a tremendous cost, why was the lunar chapter closed so definitively? In an era when resources for vital terrestrial challenges like medical research against diseases like cancer or the global fight against famine were, and remain, comparatively scarce, the purpose of such a costly and short-lived venture becomes even more beyond the political justifications of the Cold War. The central mystery remains. Was the goal simply to plant a flag, to win the race, with no further ambition? Or were there other, less apparent reasons for this sudden and lasting withdrawal from our celestial neighbor? By the mid-1970s, a profound silence had fallen over the lunar landscape. The grand adventure, the breathless race that had captivated the globe, seemed to have reached its conclusion. From the perspective of mission control and the governments that funded them, there was ostensibly nothing significant left to investigate. The primary objectives had been met with triumphant success. Geologists had their precious kilograms of lunar regolith, physicists had their solar wind data, and seismologists had their readings from the instruments left to patiently listen to the moon's inner stirrings. The political point had been made with a flag planted firmly in the sea of tranquility. Consequently, the immense financial and political will required for such an undertaking began to evaporate. The idea of dispatching another multi-billion-dollar mission simply to drill a new core sample a few hundred meters from a previous landing site lacked appeal. The even grander vision of a permanently occupied lunar station, the stepping stone to the stars, was quietly shelved, deemed an extravagant and unnecessary expense in a world grappling with terrestrial problems. The question, however, lingered in the public consciousness, a quiet but persistent echo. Why did they stop going? This abrupt halt has since become fertile ground for conspiracy theories, the most prominent of which posits that the entire Apollo program was a magnificent fabrication, a Cold War television spectacle staged in a desert studio. Yet, this theory crumbles under the weight of physical evidence. Laser retroreflectors placed on the lunar surface by Apollo astronauts are still used by observatories around the world to this day, bouncing beams of light back to Earth to measure the precise distance to the moon. High-resolution orbital photography has captured the faint tracks of the lunar rovers and the descent stages of the landers, silent monuments to a human presence. The counter-argument, a far more unsettling and persistent hypothesis, suggests not that humanity never went, but that upon arrival, they discovered they were not welcome. This narrative proposes that the moon was already occupied, and not by the Soviets. The silence from the American side is one thing, but what makes this theory so compelling to its adherents is the corresponding silence from every other spacefaring nation. The Soviet Union, America's bitter rival in the space race, never followed with their own manned mission, despite possessing the technological capability. The burgeoning Chinese space program also focused its efforts elsewhere for decades. This collective avoidance of the moon stands in stark contrast to other technological rivalries of the 20th century. When the United States detonated the first atomic bomb, it triggered a global arms race. The Soviets relentlessly pursued their own program until they achieved nuclear parity. The Chinese followed suit, as did India and Pakistan. In matters of ultimate strategic advantage, no nation willingly concedes the high ground. Why, then, would every global power unanimously agree to abandon the greatest strategic high ground imaginable? While, today, new lunar ambitions are stirring with programs like NASA's Artemis and parallel efforts from other nations, the 4-decade-long hiatus remains a profound historical anomaly. For many researchers of unexplained aerial phenomena, the answer lies in a series of strange events that began even before Neil Armstrong took his historic first step. The prelude to this mystery can be traced to May of 1969, during the mission of Apollo 10. This was the final dress rehearsal for the lunar landing. The crew to Ms. Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan flew the full mission profile, taking their command module and the lunar lander, nicknamed Snoopy, to the moon. They descended to within 9 miles of the rugged surface, scouting the landing site for Apollo 11, a critical test of all systems. It was during their transit across the far side of the moon, the hemisphere perpetually hidden from Earth, that the inexplicable occurred. Plunged into total radio silence, utterly alone in the cosmos, the astronauts began to hear something through their headsets. It was not static or the familiar hum of their equipment. It was a strange, ethereal sound, an otherworldly whistling that rose and fell in a cadence. The astronauts themselves would later describe on their internal recordings as outer space-type music. The onboard recorders, always running, captured their bewildered conversation as they tried to rationalize the unearthly symphony penetrating their capsule. The official explanation, years later, would suggest radio interference between the VHF radios of the command module and the lunar module. Yet, the astronauts themselves expressed doubt, noting the phenomenon persisted even when the two craft were not positioned to create such feedback. The music of the far side of the moon became the first of many strange footnotes in the Apollo record, a chilling overture to the question of whether humanity's first journey to another world was also its last. Not by choice, but by directive, in the vast, silent theater of cislunar space. The Apollo 10 mission served as the final dress rehearsal for humanity's greatest journey. As the command and lunar modules swung into orbit around the moon, they slipped behind its colossal bulk, entering a domain of profound isolation. On this far side, often erroneously called the dark side, the Earth is completely eclipsed, and with it, all radio communication. For the astronauts inside, it was a period of absolute solitude, an electronic silence broken only by the hum of their own life support. It was within this bubble of isolation that something wholly unexpected occurred. Suddenly, through their headsets, a series of bizarre, otherworldly sounds began to filter in. It was not static, nor was it the familiar crackle of interference. It was a structured, almost melodic phenomena. Strange, whistling symphony that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of space itself. The declassified transcripts captured the crew's bewilderment. One astronaut is heard asking, "Do you hear that? That whistling sound?" His crewmate responds, confirming the anomaly. "It sounds like, outer space-type music." For nearly an hour, as they traversed the radio shadow, this unearthly chorus persisted, an inexplicable soundtrack to their lonely voyage. Remarkably, this extraordinary event would remain a classified secret, buried deep within NASA's archives. It would not be mentioned publicly until 2008, and the audio recordings themselves would not be released to the public until 2016, nearly half a century after they were captured. The official explanation, when it finally emerged, was grounded in sober technical reasoning. NASA engineers posited that the Apollo 10 spacecraft, a complex assembly of the command module and the lunar module, was the source of its own phantom music. Each module possessed its own powerful VHF radio transmitter and receiver, operating in extremely close proximity. The theory suggested that these two systems were creating radio frequency interference, a phenomenon known as heterodyning, where the signals overlap and create new, unintended frequencies. It is a principle similar to the piercing feedback that occurs when a microphone is placed too close to its own speaker. However, this neat, technological explanation failed to satisfy many who examined the evidence. The sounds recorded were not the chaotic shrieks typical of feedback. They possessed an unusual, harmonic quality, almost as if they were composed. Furthermore, they lasted for an entire hour, a duration that seemed far too consistent for a random electronic glitch. The physical reality of their environment added another layer of complexity. Sound, as a mechanical wave, requires a medium like air or water to travel. In the near-perfect vacuum of space, there is no medium. Therefore, the astronauts could not have heard an external acoustic sound. The phenomenon had to be electromagnetic in nature, a radio signal that their equipment was somehow translating into audible noise within the sealed environment of their capsule. But what was its origin? The mystery deepens when one considers that the Apollo 10 incident was not an isolated case. Since the dawn of the space age, during the nascent orbital flights of the Mercury and Gemini programs, astronauts had reported fleeting, strange phenomena, often attributed to fatigue or the unique psychological pressures of space. Even test pilots of experimental craft, like the X-15 rocket plane, which tore through the upper atmosphere at the very edge of space, had logged encounters with unexplained radio signals. The Apollo 11 crew, on their historic lunar landing mission, also reported hearing similar strange noises. Perhaps the most compelling piece of corroborating evidence, however, came from the other side of the Iron Curtain. Soviet cosmonauts flying in spacecraft of a completely different design and technological lineage had also documented hearing these same eerie transmissions. This crucial detail severely weakened the argument that the sounds were merely a technical quirk specific to the Apollo hardware. But the definitive challenge to the official interference theory would come from the Apollo 11 mission itself. After its most historic achievement, once Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had successfully landed the lunar module, the Eagle, they eventually ascended to rejoin Michael Collins in the orbiting command module. The Columbia, the Eagle was left behind, a permanent monument on the Sea of Tranquility. As the reunited crew of the Columbia once again passed behind the moon, into the familiar radio silence, the impossible happened. The strange music returned. This single fact presented a critical, unanswerable flaw in the official explanation. The primary source of the supposed interference, the lunar module's radio system, was now hundreds of kilometers below them on the lunar surface. The two spacecraft were no longer in proximity, yet the phantom signals persisted in the astronauts' headsets. The logical and perfectly rational explanation of interference from their own systems no longer applied. They were alone, with a piece of their vessel missing. Yet the ghostly chorus from the void remained. The question, then, was no longer just what they were hearing, but what was truly generating this impossible music on the far side of the moon. The official chronicle of space exploration is one of triumphant engineering and human courage. Yet parallel to this celebrated history runs a darker, more enigmatic undercurrent. A series of events that defy simple explanation. One of the earliest and most peculiar incidents connected to the Apollo 11 mission was not an anomaly that occurred in the vacuum of space, but one that unfolded on paper 3 months before humanity would take its giant leap. As the launch date approached, Commander Neil Armstrong, alongside his crewmates, was thrust into the global spotlight, becoming the focal point of the world's hopes and curiosities. Their mailboxes at NASA were flooded with correspondence, a deluge of letters from school children, scientists, and citizens from every corner of the globe. It was a routine part of their public relations duties to engage with this outpouring. However, among the thousands of well-wishes and technical questions, one letter stood out for its audacious and unsettling premise. The anonymous author posed a question that seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than to the pragmatic world of spaceflight. What were the protocols if the Apollo 11 crew encountered extraterrestrial life on the lunar surface? Were they equipped, the letter inquired, to establish peaceful contact, or, more alarmingly, to defend themselves against a potentially hostile intelligence? To most, such a query would be dismissed as fanciful paranoia. Yet, Neil Armstrong, the famously stoic and unflappable test pilot, chose to respond. His reply, written with a characteristic lack of emotion, has since become a source of intense speculation. The letter, which recently fetched over $4,000 at auction, is a masterclass in ambiguity. Armstrong calmly explained that no, the crew was not specifically prepared for such a contingency. He did not deny the possibility or ridicule the question. Instead, he stated plainly that their mission parameters did not include preparations for alien contact. He simply outlined their standard procedure. They would first orbit the moon, meticulously surveying their landing site, and upon touching down, they would conduct a thorough visual inspection from the safety of the lunar module before ever opening the hatch. On the surface, it appears to be a perfectly diplomatic and logical answer. But for those who scrutinize the history of unidentified aerial phenomena, Armstrong's carefully chosen words are far from a simple dismissal. He was not negating the potential for an encounter. He was merely stating a fact about their operational readiness. This cautious phrasing gains a more profound significance when viewed through the lens of persistent conspiracy theories, which allege that the United States government, and by extension NASA, had been aware of a non-human presence since at least 1947. This knowledge, theorists claim, did not originate with the infamous Roswell incident, but with a far more clandestine event, an alleged meeting between President Dwight D. Eisenhower and alien emissaries. If such a monumental secret were being kept, then Armstrong's response could be interpreted as a carefully constructed statement from a man who knew more than he could say, a man bound by the highest levels of national security. But a cryptic letter can be dismissed. An eyewitness account from a man who walked on the moon is far more difficult to ignore. This brings us to another perplexing incident, this time recounted by Armstrong's crewmate, Buzz Aldrin. While their Saturn V rocket propelled them through the black, silent void between Earth and the Moon, the astronauts observed something that did not belong. Aldrin reported that an object, a brilliant point of light, began to pace their command module. It wasn't a fleeting meteor or a piece of orbital debris. It maintained a consistent position relative to their craft, following them with what seemed like intelligent persistence for the entire duration of their outbound journey. Inside the cramped confines of the capsule, a quiet, professional concern took hold. The crew knew their communications were being broadcast globally, monitored by allies and adversaries alike. Any open discussion of an unidentified flying object would trigger worldwide panic and a geopolitical crisis. They had to be discreet. In a moment of cool-headed thinking, Aldrin keyed his microphone and contacted Mission Control in Houston. He didn't ask, "What is this strange light following us?" Instead, he posed a technical question, a piece of procedural code, to eliminate a known variable. He requested the exact position of the SIVB, the final booster stage of their rocket, which had been jettisoned hours earlier. The astronauts reasoned that the object could be sunlight glinting off a piece of their own discarded hardware. A tense silence followed as controllers on the ground checked the telemetry. The response from Houston came back, clear and unequivocal, sealing the mystery. The SIVB booster, they were informed, was over 6,000 miles away from their current position. The confirmation hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone on the loop. The object shadowing Apollo 11 was not theirs. It was an unknown, deep within the void that separates Earth from its lunar companion. The crew of Apollo 11 proceeded on the most audacious journey ever undertaken by humanity. 3 men, encapsulated in a marvel of engineering, were acutely aware that their every move, every word, was being monitored by a watchful planet. Yet, under this immense pressure, an observation was made that would not fit neatly into the mission logs. Had the object been a known piece of debris or a familiar celestial body, the astronauts would not have fixated on it, nor would it have been positioned so tantalizingly close to their craft. One of them posed the question, a query sent into the metallic confines of the capsule. What else could it possibly be? For a long, silent stretch of the voyage, the question hung unanswered. Nothing happened. The object simply paced them, an silent, enigmatic companion in the solar glare. As the crew trained a small, powerful onboard telescope on the anomaly, its features resolved from a mere point of light into a discernible and deeply strange configuration. It appeared to have the distinct shape of an open book, or perhaps a large, metallic letter L, tumbling through the blackness. This specific and unnatural geometry was a detail later corroborated not only by Buzz Aldrin, but also by the third member of the crew, Michael Collins. Collins, the man destined to become the loneliest human in history while orbiting the moon solo, had a unique perspective. It was Hewa, in his isolated vigil, would also report hearing inexplicable transmissions, strange wooing sounds that permeated the silence of his orbital journey. The sighting of the L-shaped object was, of course, dutifully reported to Mission Control in Houston. In the world of spaceflight, every anomaly, no matter how trivial, is logged and analyzed. But this particular report was handled with extreme discretion. While communicated internally, it was carefully shielded from public disclosure, filed away from the triumphant narrative of the lunar landing. Decades would have to pass, the mission fading into the annals of history, before Aldrin would publicly recount the experience. When he finally did, the reaction from the established scientific community was not one of curiosity, but of swift and severe condemnation. He was instantly branded as fanciful, his credibility as a man of science and a heroic astronaut called into question. The backlash was so intense that Aldrin found himself cornered, forced to publicly walk back his own testimony. He issued a clarifying statement, insisting his words had been misinterpreted. He never claimed, he asserted, that the object was of extraterrestrial origin. Instead, he offered a plausible, almost mundane explanation. The object they had observed was likely one of the 4 large panels from the SIVB rocket stage, which had been jettisoned to allow the Lunar Module 2 dock with the command module. It was a perfectly reasonable, logical, and scientifically sound explanation. It would have closed the case entirely, were it not for the dissenting voices from the very heart of NASA's operations, the engineers and scientists who had been watching from mission control. Among them was Dr. David Baker, a senior engineer and an integral part of the Apollo 11 mission analysis team. Dr. Baker, from his console in Houston, had access to telemetry and tracking data unavailable to the astronauts themselves. He would later declare that he, too, had witnessed the anomalous object on tracking screens. More importantly, he stated with professional certainty that, based on the object's trajectory, its distance from the Apollo capsule, and the precise timing of the observation, it simply could not have been one of the discarded panels. Those panels had a predictable, calculated trajectory, and this object was not following it. It was somewhere it shouldn't be, behaving in a way it shouldn't behave. It was not, he insisted, conventional space junk. This professional testimony cast a long shadow over Aldrin's reluctant retraction. It suggested that Aldrin, despite the public ridicule he endured, privately held a far more extraordinary belief. Subsequent statements he made over the years hinted that he, along with Armstrong and Collins, genuinely believed they had witnessed an unidentified flying object in the truest, most profound sense of the term. The object had not been a fleeting glimpse. It was a persistent presence, accompanying them for a significant portion of their translunar coast. At one point seeking more precise data, the crew reportedly used a sextant, a navigational tool ancient in principle but vital for spaceflight, to take a reading on the object. The results were startling. The object was not a distant phenomenon, but was calculated to be unnervingly close, far nearer than their initial visual estimates had suggested. With this new data point, the entire character of the event shifted. It was no longer a passive curiosity observed from afar, but a proximate and unexplained variable in the most critical mission in human history. The narrative becomes stranger still, as this encounter was apparently not the only anomalous event the Apollo astronauts would face on their journey into the unknown. The phenomena of anomalous sightings was not exclusive to the inaugural mission. In fact, a consistent thread of unusual observations runs through the astronaut corps of that pioneering era. Subsequent crews, men trained to be the most sober and empirical of observers, also reported witnessing objects in the void that defied simple explanation. These were not misidentified stars or terrestrial satellites. They were described as things that simply did not belong in the celestial tableau, as humanity understood it. It is crucial to contextualize the environment of that time. Today, the space immediately surrounding our planet is a veritable junkyard. Low Earth orbit, and even the pathways beyond, are now a treacherous cloud of man-made debris. This orbital wasteland consists of countless fragments, the spent stages of powerful rockets, the silent husks of defunct satellites tumbling end over end, flecks of paint, and shrapnel from accidental collisions, all moving at hypervelocities. It is a chaotic and cluttered frontier. But the period between 1969 and the final Apollo mission in 1972 was starkly different. Space was a pristine, almost sterile environment. The celestial sphere was uncluttered by the detritus of human ambition, making any unidentified object, particularly one of significant size and apparent structure, an event of profound anomaly. Yet, in the wake of Apollo 11 and Buzz Aldrin's carefully worded allusions to a mysterious object, the operational momentum of the space program continued unabated. Several more voyages to the lunar surface were successfully executed. From an institutional perspective, these anecdotal reports, however compelling, seemingly had little to no impact on NASA's overarching mission objectives. Whether an astronaut had a fleeting encounter with an object of potentially extraterrestrial origin was a data point that paled in comparison to the geopolitical urgency of the space race. The agency, a massive organization under immense public and political scrutiny, maintained its course, methodically preparing and launching its crews toward the moon. This raises a far more perplexing question. If these sightings were not the deterrent, what was the true catalyst that ultimately halted humanity's journeys to its celestial neighbor? The answer, according to a persistent and controversial narrative, is far stranger than any simple sighting. It was in the late 1990s, as the internet began to connect disparate communities of researchers and enthusiasts, that a startling piece of alleged evidence emerged from the digital ether. The story centered on a supposed secret communication, a fragment of dialogue said to have been surreptitiously captured by an amateur radio operator. The setting for this alleged interception is often depicted as a remote listening post, somewhere in the vast, sparsely populated Australian outback, a location ideal for tracking deep space transmissions with minimal terrestrial interference. This account, it must be unequivocally stated, resides firmly in the realm of conspiracy theory and has been consistently and officially denied by all relevant authorities. It is a piece of modern folklore, not a verified historical record. But the narrative it presents is a chilling one. The supposed transcript, pieced together from these alleged recordings, paints a picture of discovery and immediate suppression. An Apollo mission, its specific designation often debated, communicates with mission control in a state of alarm and wonder. The astronaut's voice crackles across the void. "What is that? Do we have any explanation for this?" The response from Houston is portrayed as unnervingly calm, almost rehearsed. "We do not. Don't worry. Continue with the program." This reply suggests a disinterest that borders on prior knowledge. The astronaut, seemingly captivated by the sight, presses on. "Oh my God. This is truly fantastic. You could never imagine this." Houston's alleged reply is even more revealing. "We know about that. Could you go in another direction? Go to the other side." The dialogue escalates, a mixture of awe and fear in the astronaut's voice. "This is spectacular. God, what is that? What the hell is that?" It is at this critical juncture that Houston issues a terse, coded command. "Change to Tango. Change to Tango. Change to Tango." In the lexicon of NASA communications, each frequency band used for communication was assigned a specific code name. Changing to Tango was an instruction to switch to a different, predetermined frequency. This was a standard procedure designed to ensure a clear signal, but in this context, its purpose is interpreted as a method of immediately securing the channel. Any unauthorized listener, such as a radio ham, who had managed to lock onto the public broadcast frequency, would be instantly cut off. While they frantically scanned the radio spectrum for the new channel, the sensitive, classified portion of the message would have already been transmitted on the secure and likely encrypted Tango frequency. The command to change to Tango thus becomes the moment the curtain of secrecy allegedly fell, silencing a conversation that was never meant for public ears. A voice, allegedly from the Apollo mission, cuts through the cosmic silence, its tone a stark departure from the carefully rehearsed procedural language. "There's a sort of brilliant light over there now," it reports, the words laced with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Back in Houston, the world's most advanced control center holds its breath. The confirmation comes quickly. "Houston, we have it. We saw it." The message is clear, but its meaning is profoundly ambiguous. A new voice interjects with a warning, a sense of urgency bleeding through the transmission. "Attention, we're losing communication. It's dropping fast. Switch to Tango Bravo." Tango, the technical jargon barely masks the underlying tension as another voice, identified in these disputed transcripts as coming from the astronaut codenamed Jezebel, seems to reaffirm the sighting. The response from the Apollo crewman is electric, a moment of pure, unfiltered astonishment. "Yes, but this is incredible," he exclaims. "Let's switch to Bravo Tango. It's marvelous. Believe it." At that precise moment, the public feed reportedly goes dead. But in the shadowy realm of this apocryphal tale, the conversation continues, now shielded from the world's ears. "Those things are giant," one astronaut allegedly states, his voice heavy with disbelief. He seems to be arguing with himself, or perhaps with a crewmate, against the most logical explanation. No, this is not an optical illusion. No one is going to believe this. The transcript paints a picture of mission control in frantic confusion, their calls piercing the void. Houston calling, "What is it? What? What the devil is going on? What's happening?" The reply from the lunar surface is chilling in its simplicity and its staggering implications. "They're here. They are here." A voice from Houston, desperate for clarity, presses again. "What's wrong there?" The response broadens the scope of the encounter from a mere sighting to a confirmed presence. We've seen some visitors. They were here for a while. Mission Control, struggling to process the information, demands confirmation. Repeat the last information. The astronaut's next alleged statement transforms the scenario entirely. I'm saying there are other spacecraft. They are lined up on the other side of the crater. The demand comes again. A desperate plea for verification. Repeat. Repeat the human toll of this supposed encounter. Then becomes painfully clear. My heavens. My hands are shaking so much I can't do anything. A voice confesses, the disciplined training of a lifetime dissolving in the face of the unknown. The focus shifts to documentation, to capturing proof. The film, have these damn cameras picked up anything? The reply is a lament of a missed opportunity. Did you pick anything up? I didn't have any film on hand. This entire exchange, according to proponents of the theory, constitutes the true, hidden conversation that took place moments after the lunar module crew stepped onto the moon. A moment when they realized they were not alone. Yet, this narrative is not recognized by any official source. It is a story riddled with contradictions and inconsistencies. The official position from the space agencies is unequivocal and absolute. The transcript is a complete fabrication, a baseless rumor, a modern myth invented by an unknown author with no connection to reality. Their denial is two-pronged and formidable. Not only do they vehemently reject the content of the message as pure fiction, but they also deploy a technical argument that seems to close the case entirely. They assert that it was technologically impossible for unauthorized individuals on Earth to have intercepted the astronauts' private communications channels. With that, the discussion should have ended. If no one could have been listening, then the story is, by definition, a hoax. It becomes just another piece of folklore, a tall tale to be dismissed before the conversation moves on. Except for one inconvenient fact that fractures the foundation of that official denial. A verifiable communication was, indeed, captured. The man who achieved this was Larry Weisner, an American amateur radio operator. From his home, using his own custom-built equipment, he aimed his VHF antenna at the heavens. On July 23, 1969, just 4 days after the historic Apollo 11 liftoff, Weisinger accomplished what NASA had suggested was impossible. He tuned into the frequency and, through the crackle of static, the clear voices of the astronauts filled his room. For 35 uninterrupted minutes, he listened to the routine chatter between the crew and flight control. There was nothing strange or alarming in what he heard. It was standard operational dialogue, but the very existence of the recording was monumental. He promptly informed a journalist. The story was published, and Weisinger briefly became a minor celebrity. Initially met with skepticism, his claim was ultimately investigated by NASA itself. Faced with the undeniable audio evidence, the agency had no choice but to concede. They publicly recognized that the recording was authentic. The amateur enthusiast had, against all odds, managed to successfully intercept a genuine Apollo transmission. This single, verified event proved that the official narrative of impenetrable communications was not entirely true. It demonstrated that someone, with the right knowledge and equipment, could listen in, and this admission inadvertently pries the door open once more. If a routine conversation could be overheard, it begs the question, what other, more sensitive transmissions might have been sent? This brings us to the other side of the story. Even after official channels vehemently deny a piece of communication, dismissing it as fabricated and lacking any verifiable origin, its echoes can persist, finding new life in the fertile ground of public suspicion. Such was the case with a controversial transmission allegedly connected to the Apollo missions. While mainstream history filed it away as a hoax, certain individuals, often those with tantalizing proximity to the events themselves, chose to resurrect the story, breathing new life into the legend. Among the most prominent of these figures was an aerospace engineer named William Bill Tompkins. In his later years, Tompkins would step forward from the classified shadows of the military-industrial complex to make a series of astonishing claims. He did not merely repeat the rumor. In his book, provocatively titled Selected by Extraterrestrials, Tompkins asserted that he was not just a distant observer, but a direct witness. He maintained that he was present in the control rooms, and personally overheard the cryptic and unsettling communication that the world was never meant to hear. The book itself became a cornerstone text for an alternative history of the space race. In its pages, Tompkins meticulously laid out his credentials, positioning himself as a key insider. He claimed to have been embedded within the very heart of the Apollo program, not as a direct NASA employee, but as a highly placed contractor for a major aerospace corporation, and as an integral part of the engineering team at Douglas Aircraft. This background placed him, at least in his telling, at the Nerve Center in Houston during the most critical moments of lunar exploration. The assertions made by Tompkins were, by any conventional measure, extraordinary, bordering on the unbelievable. Yet, what lent them a perplexing weight was the verifiable fact that this man was precisely who he claimed to be. His career in advanced aerospace was a matter of public record. His publication wasn't just a collection of rumors. It was a supposed first-hand account, detailing the phrases that were allegedly spoken, and more importantly, the shocking context that the inner circle of the space program, already possessed a framework for understanding them. This pre-existing knowledge, Tompkins argued, was no recent development. It stretched back decades, to the pivotal year of 1947, a clear reference to the Roswell incident, suggesting a long-held, deeply guarded secret of an extraterrestrial presence. But the narrative did not stop there. Tompkins' account ventured into even more profound territory, insisting that the lunar encounter was not some random, unforeseen event. He contended that the entire Apollo program, presented to the world as a peaceful mission of scientific discovery, was merely a cover for a far more aggressive and clandestine agenda. In his text, he alleges that the true mission was codenamed Project Nova. According to the detailed descriptions provided by Bill Tompkins, Project Nova was a secret United States Navy initiative of staggering ambition. Its ultimate objective was not to collect moon rocks, but to establish a permanent, heavily fortified military base on the moon. This was not envisioned as a small scientific outpost, but a sprawling subterranean complex, a lunar city designed to house, at its peak operational capacity, a force of 10,000 military and technical personnel. This lunar bastion was to be equipped with a formidable arsenal, featuring not only advanced defensive weaponry to guard against potential extraterrestrial threats, but also sophisticated offensive systems. These weapons, he claimed, could be directed at hostile forces on other planets, or perhaps more chillingly, used to project overwhelming power against rival nations back on Earth. The strategic implications were immense. Furthermore, the base was designed with a dual purpose: to serve as an impregnable refuge, a sanctuary for humanity's elite in the event of a catastrophic nuclear exchange on Earth. While it sounds like science fiction, the concept gains a disturbing plausibility when viewed through the paranoid lens of the Cold War. The financial scale of the Apollo program has always been a point of contention. The cost, when adjusted for inflation, was astronomical, equivalent to commissioning entire fleets of aircraft carriers or constructing dozens of heavily armed fortresses. A colossal portion of the national budget was diverted to this singular goal. And for what publicly declared return? Roughly 382 kilograms of lunar samples, and a dozen historic space. While the scientific value is undeniable and its inspirational power immense, a stark question remains. Was that truly the whole story? It is within this vast discrepancy between cost and stated benefit that hypotheses like Tompkins take root. What if that incredible torrent of money, technology, and human effort had a final, undeclared purpose? What if the footprints and the flag were merely the grandest piece of political theater ever staged? A brilliant distraction from the true objective: the construction of a military stronghold on the ultimate high ground. The Cold War narrative is often told through the lens of terrestrial conflicts and earthly anxieties, but its most ambitious theater of operations may have been the silent, airless expanse of space. Consider the political climate of the 1980s. An era defined by the escalating tensions between two global superpowers. It was during this period that the United States government, under President Ronald Reagan, unveiled its Strategic Defense Initiative, a concept so futuristic it was immediately nicknamed Star Wars by the press. This was a proposal for a sophisticated, space-based shield, a network of satellites armed with lasers and projectiles designed to intercept and vaporize Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles in mid-flight. But what if this public-facing program was merely a shadow of a far more audacious, far more secret ambition? What if the ultimate high ground wasn't low Earth orbit, but the moon itself? Imagine the strategic advantage. Nuclear missile silos nestled in the lunar dust, capable of launching attacks against any target on Earth with impunity. Their trajectory nearly impossible to predict or counter. Picture vast subterranean bunkers carved deep into the lunar rock, shielded by kilometers of regolith, serving as impregnable command centers and shelters for the governmental elite, ensuring the continuity of the American government, even as the home planet was consumed by the fires of a Third World War. When framed within the ruthless logic of Cold War geopolitics, the notion of militarizing the moon ceases to sound like science fiction and begins to resemble a chillingly plausible strategic endgame. This is precisely the scenario that whistleblowers like aerospace draftsman William Tompkins allege was not just plausible, but an active and highly classified objective. According to Tompkins, the Apollo program was a veil for a far grander military project, to establish a permanent foothold on the moon, complete with nuclear capabilities and secure installations. However, this ambitious plan allegedly encountered an insurmountable obstacle. The territory was, as Tompkins claimed, already occupied. The famous words purportedly spoken by astronaut Neil Armstrong during a 2-minute radio blackout at Krypton and Earth message to Mission Control were not about technical difficulties. The report, according to this narrative, was that they were already there. The implication was staggering. While the world celebrated a monumental human achievement, the astronauts and a select few in Mission Control understood that humanity was not alone, and that these silent observers were deeply displeased with the prospect of Earth's wars being exported to their cosmic doorstep. It is a fantastic claim, yet the story only deepens from there. William Tompkins insisted his involvement was direct and personal. He asserted that during the Apollo 11 mission, he was one of the few individuals privy to the secure, closed-circuit video feeds being transmitted from the lunar surface feeds the public never saw. In a secure room, far from the celebratory crowds, Tompkins claimed he witnessed incredible sights. Colossal spacecraft of non-human origin parked along the rim of a crater, silently observing the lunar module. He maintained that he was tasked with documenting these events, his hand sketching the unbelievable craft he saw in the monitors. Immediately following this alleged encounter, an information lockdown of unprecedented scale was supposedly initiated. All related data, the audio recordings, the uncut video transmissions, the technical telemetry, and Tompkins' own drawings were swept into the deepest vaults of the national security apparatus, classified under a designation that Tompkins described as being beyond top secret. Every shred of physical evidence was systematically sequestered or destroyed. Simultaneously, a sophisticated and ruthless program of psychological warfare was reportedly implemented. Its goal was to create an atmosphere of intense ridicule around the subject, ensuring that any credible witness from an astronaut to an engineer who dared to speak out would be immediately discredited, their careers ruined, and their testimony relegated to the baldello. Ridiculo, the tranco de ridiculos. Decades later, with the key players aging, Tompkins asserted that he had received personal, albeit private, confirmation of these events. He claimed that in separate telephone conversations, he spoke directly with both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and that both men, the first humans to walk on another world, confirmed what they had witnessed that day in 1969. Adding another layer to this labyrinthine tale, a separate and unverified account emerged from an individual identified only as a scientist. This person alleged that they had been part of the team that interviewed Armstrong and Aldrin after their mandatory post-mission quarantine, and that both astronauts acknowledged an enigmatic presence on the moon, yet, with no official documentation or on their record statements, these extraordinary claims remained adrift, becoming part of the vast, unverified Paya de la Historia, the chaff of history. For years, the story lay dormant, a footnote in the annals of ufology, until it captured the attention of Dr. Stephen Greer. Greer, a physician and prominent founder of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or CSETI, an organization distinct from the more mainstream SETI, was known for his aggressive pursuit of government disclosure. Intrigued by the persistence of the Apollo 11 encounter story, Greer decided to investigate, believing it might hold a kernel of truth. He embarked on a new line of inquiry, one that bypassed the official channels and layers of secrecy. He reached out directly to the people who would know the astronauts best, their families and close associates. With Armstrong and Aldrin still bound by their oaths or unwilling to speak publicly, Greer hoped to find a crack in the wall of silence. And what he discovered, he would later claim, was astonishing. Whispers from within the aerospace community, fragments of conversations held in hushed tones, began to coalesce around a singular, unnerving narrative. Individuals, often years after their service, allegedly confessed to a truth they had been told to bury. They spoke of briefings, of classified reports detailing what the Apollo astronauts truly encountered on the lunar surface. The story was consistent. Something had been found up there, an object or structure of such colossal scale that it defied all terrestrial understanding. It was, they claimed, definitively not of this Earth. This monumental discovery was the secret centerpiece of the entire Apollo program. Of course, within the cold light of day, such extraordinary claims immediately invite profound skepticism. This entire narrative could very well be a modern form of folklore, what one might dismiss as elaborate hoaxes or It is a landscape ripe for fabrication, where sensationalism can be easily monetized. One could imagine an enterprising author, sensing a market for the incredible, meticulously crafting a book filled with compelling but ultimately baseless myths. A work of pure fantasy, presented as fact, without a single shred of verifiable evidence to support its staggering assertions. It is a plausible, improbable explanation for such tales. And yet, the story persists, interwoven with other, more familiar narratives of doubt. Consider the long-standing conspiracy theory asserting that humanity never reached the moon at all. This well-trodden hypothesis posits that the entire endeavor was a magnificent deception, staged in a secure film studio somewhere in the United States. The theory often goes further, naming the architect of the illusion, the master filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. Proponents claim that, fresh off his cinematic triumph with 2001, A Space Odyssey, Kubrick was secretly contracted by the government to direct and photograph the fake lunar landings, using his unparalleled cinematic skills to fool the entire world. For decades, this theory has been thoroughly debunked by an overwhelming body of scientific evidence. However, what if this claim, while incorrect in its premise, holds a kernel of a more complex truth? What if it possesses a hidden, darker side? If we entertain the assertions made by figures like aerospace engineer William Tompkins, or researcher Stephen Greer, or even author Donnie Marshall, a startling alternate possibility emerges. If their claims are true, if the Apollo 11 crew arrived to find the lunar surface already occupied, scattered with non-terrestrial craft and alien artifacts, then the mission's public portrayal would have faced an insurmountable crisis. NASA could not possibly broadcast those images to a waiting world. The ontological shock, the global panic, the geopolitical chaos, it would have been uncontrollable. In this terrifying scenario, a desperate solution presents itself. The landing was real, but the footage was not. The astronauts did walk on the moon, but what they saw had to be censored. This would have necessitated the rapid, secret reproduction of the moonwalks on a controlled set. Every step, every salute to the flag, every geological sample collected would have to be painstakingly reenacted to create a sanitized version of events for public consumption. This frightening possibility provides a chilling new context for the old conspiracy theories. Perhaps the inconsistencies and lighting anomalies that critics point to in the Apollo footage are not evidence of a complete fabrication, but rather the subtle mistakes made during a rushed and desperate cinematic cover, designed to hide the friends, as some insiders called them, who are watching from the shadows of the lunar craters. Yet, a glaring paradox remains. If the moon was such a hazardous or diplomatically sensitive location, why did NASA continue to send astronauts there? After the triumphant Apollo 11 mission came Apollo 12, the near-disastrous Apollo 13, and missions 14, 15, 16, and 17 repeatedly returned to a place that harbored such a profound and potentially dangerous secret. William Tompkins offered a chillingly pragmatic explanation. They had no other choice. To suddenly abort the most expensive and celebrated program in human history after a single landing would have been an admission of catastrophic failure. The entire space program, a cornerstone of American pride and technological supremacy in the Cold War, would have been rendered a global laughingstock. The political and institutional fallout would have been devastating. Furthermore, they had to go back to gather more intelligence, to understand the nature of the presence they had discovered. They had to be certain of what would happen next. This also explains the curious silence from their Cold War rivals. The Soviets, with their own powerful tracking systems, would surely have known if something was amiss, but they said nothing. Perhaps they knew precisely what the Americans had found, and understood that any attempt to land themselves, perhaps to establish their own military foothold with nuclear devices, would be met with the same silent, overwhelming opposition. The secret created a fragile, unwritten truce, a shared knowledge of a power far greater than their own terrestrial squabbles. The space race was over, not because one side had won, but because the finish line was already occupied. But even this intricate web of secrets, lies, and silent truces is not the complete picture. Every layer peeled back reveals another, darker one beneath it, and everything that has been discussed so far, from faked footage to a secret alien presence, still conceals an even more disturbing facet of the truth. In the politically charged atmosphere of the early 1970s, with the Cold War space race defining an era of unprecedented technological ambition and geopolitical tension, a startling proposition emerged from behind the Iron Curtain. To Soviet scientists, Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov of the Soviet Academy of Sciences published an article that sent ripples through the international scientific community. Their hypothesis was not a minor revision of lunar geology, but a radical reimagining of the moon's very existence. They declared that Earth's constant celestial companion was not a natural satellite at all, but an artificial constructor, colossal, ancient spacecraft, meticulously engineered by an unknown intelligence and placed into its precise orbit long ago. This was not merely a fringe theory whispered in hushed tones. It was a detailed argument from respected members of the Soviet scientific establishment who posited that the moon was an immensely old object, a relic from a forgotten age, silently watching over humanity. Their claims were immediately viewed as bizarre, a stark deviation from all established astronomical and geological models. The prevailing scientific consensus, supported by increasingly sophisticated mathematical and physical calculations, depicted the moon as a solid, differentiated body. This standard model described a world with a relatively thin crust, a vast, sprawling mantle significantly lighter than Earth's, and a small, dense core. It was a world formed from cosmic debris, a natural satellite in every sense. Yet, Vasin and Sherbakov insisted this entire picture was wrong. They boldly asserted that the moon was hollow, and they built their extraordinary case upon two specific, well-documented, and perplexing events that had occurred during NASA's Apollo missions. The first piece of their puzzle came from the Apollo 12 mission in November 1969. After astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean returned to the command module, the mission's lunar module, Intrepid was intentionally sent on a collision course with the lunar surface. The controlled impact was designed as a seismic experiment, a way to create an artificial moonquake to test the sensitive seismographs that had been placed on the ocean of storms by the Apollo 11 crew. The module, a mere speck against the vastness of the moon, struck the surface with a calculated force. What happened next stunned the observers in mission control. The seismic instruments registered the impact, but the vibrations didn't dissipate as expected. Instead, the entire moon began to resonate, to reverberate for an astonishing 8 full minutes. Scientists on the ground described the phenomenon with a powerful and unsettling analogy. It was as if someone had struck a massive gong or a giant bell. One must consider the sheer scale of this event. The moon is a gigantic sphere of rock, over 2,000 miles in diameter. The lunar module was, in comparison, an insignificant gnat. For such a minuscule impact to cause the entire celestial body to ring, to vibrate so profoundly and for so long, defied conventional geological explanation. The second, and even more dramatic, piece of evidence arose from the near disaster of the Apollo 13 mission in April 1970. As the crippled spacecraft, its crew fighting for their lives, swung around the far side of the moon, they jettisoned their third-stage rocket booster, the SIVB. This object, significantly larger and more massive than the lunar module, slammed into the moon with the force of over 11 tons of T. The resulting seismic shock wave was cataclysmic. The vibrations from this impact lasted for over 30 minutes, while the reverberations, the celestial echo, continued for more than 3 hours. The data suggested an effect akin to striking an enormous, hollow metallic disc, causing it to oscillate with a deep, resonant hum. For the two Soviet scientists, these seismic events were the smoking gun. They argued with unwavering insistence that such prolonged resonance was physically impossible for a solid celestial body. Wave energy in a solid, rocky sphere would be dampened and absorbed relatively quickly. The only plausible explanation, they concluded, was that the moon must be a hollow sphere. From this, they deduced a far more complex structure. A gigantic, engineered shell protected by a thick, accumulated layer of cosmic dust, pulverized rock, and debris. This outer coating, perhaps miles thick, would serve as a natural armor, shielding the interior from the constant barrage of asteroids and other celestial objects, while a formidable intermetallic hull provided the true structural integrity. Vasin and Sherbakov further supported their theory by pointing to another lunar anomaly. The nature of its craters. There is a well-understood principle in impact physics where the diameter of a crater corresponds to a certain depth based on the energy of the impactor and the composition of the surface. However, many of the moon's largest craters are strangely shallow, almost as if something incredibly hard and impenetrable lies just beneath the surface, preventing deeper excavation. This, they argued, was evidence of the super-strong inner hull of the artificial structure, a barrier that even the most powerful asteroid impacts could not breach, causing the impact energy to be displaced horizontally, creating wide saucer-like depressions instead of deep conical craters. Proponents of a radical fringe theory, however, argue that certain lunar craters present a profound anomaly, one that defies conventional geological explanation. They point to vast impact basins, some stretching for hundreds of kilometers, that are disproportionately shallow, penetrating the lunar surface by a mere 3 or 4 kilometers. Standard impact physics would dictate a much deeper scar. This observation gave rise to a startling hypothesis that beneath the blanket of gray regolith lies an protective crust. This wasn't merely a geological quirk. It was interpreted as evidence of artifice. This line of reasoning culminated in the spaceship moon theory, most famously articulated by two Soviet scientists, Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov, in the 1970s. They proposed that our moon is not a natural satellite at all, but a colossal, ancient, and hollow spacecraft, meticulously constructed by a civilization far beyond our own comprehension. They argued that this artificial shell, perhaps composed of a super-hardened titanium alloy, was designed to withstand cosmic impacts, explaining the shallow craters. The theory posits that this colossal vessel was, at some distant point in history, piloted into its strangely perfect orbit around Earth. While dismissed by mainstream science, these ideas persist, fueled by what some see as a collection of irreconcilable facts about the moon's density, its precise orbital mechanics, and its calculated moment of inertia. Within this framework, the moon transforms from a celestial neighbor into a silent, monolithic artifact of unknown origin. The implications of such a construct are staggering, suggesting a history in our solar system far more complex and populated than ever imagined, and that humanity's first steps off-world were onto territory that was, in a sense, already claimed. This leads directly to a re-examination of the Cold War's frantic race to reach it. According to this alternative narrative, the Apollo program was never just about planting a flag or scientific exploration. It was the public face of a much more clandestine objective, a program of colonization. But this was not a civilian endeavor for the betterment of mankind. It was a strategic military initiative. The goal was to establish heavily fortified bases on the lunar surface, transforming the moon into the ultimate high ground. From this vantage point, a superpower could wield unprecedented military potential, establishing surveillance outposts and missile silos that could target any point on Earth with impunity. Furthermore, In an era defined by the terrifying specter of nuclear annihilation, deep lunar bunkers would serve as impregnable refuges for political and military leadership in the event of a catastrophic Third World War. This interpretation suggests the space race was not about prestige, but about a desperate scramble for strategic dominance. The Soviet Union's own lunar program, therefore, was driven by the exact same terrifying logic. A competition to see which ideology could first weaponize Earth as satellite. Yet, the story takes an even more dramatic turn. The theory alleges that upon reaching the lunar surface, both American and Soviet efforts collided with a shocking reality. The moon was already occupied. This was not an occupation in the traditional sense, with visible cities or structures. Instead, it was a subtle but undeniable presence of visitors from the cosmos. Proponents claim that astronauts from multiple missions, both American and Soviet, encountered phenomena that were scrubbed from public record. They cite the strange, musical sounds heard by the Apollo 10 crew on the far side of the moon, officially dismissed as radio interference. They point to numerous reports of small intelligently moving objects that shadowed the command modules, and the persistent, unconfirmed rumor that Neil Armstrong himself reported seeing other larger spacecraft observing the Apollo 11 landing from the rim of a nearby crater. Faced with the realization that they were not alone and were intruding upon a domain governed by a vastly superior intelligence, both superpowers were allegedly forced to retreat. Their ambitious plans for lunar militarization were abruptly and silently abandoned. This chilling discovery, the theory contends, necessitated a massive cut. This is where the narrative intersects with a persistent belief that some moon landing footage was fabricated. The argument is not that humans never went to the moon, but that the original video and audio evidence from the missions was too revelatory, to paradigm-shattering for public consumption. It would have shown things that governments could not explain and did not want to reveal proof of the cosmic visitors. Consequently, certain segments would have been refilmed in a secure studio environment to create a sanitized version of events for the history books. This would explain why some original Apollo mission tapes have been famously lost or taped over by NASA. Convenient accident, or the deliberate destruction of irrefutable evidence. The theories, while unproven, weave a complex tapestry of speculation. Adding another layer to the mystery are the accounts from the era's radio hobbyists. In the same year that official channels might have been censoring transmissions, it's claimed that ordinary amateur radio operators, using relatively simple ground equipment, successfully intercepted unfiltered communications from the mission's communications that allegedly contained conversations about the unidentified objects. Could it be that while the world watched a carefully curated broadcast, a handful of civilians were listening in on the unvarnished, terrifying truth? Or is this entire narrative merely a modern myth? A grand conjecture born from the shadows of the Cold War and humanity's enduring fascination with the unknown. It is a peculiar characteristic of modern mythology that for every established fact, a counter-narrative seems to flourish in the fertile ground of the digital age. Behind the towering monument of historical record, a shadow world of doubt persists. If one were to consult a search engine regarding the enduring hoax allegations surrounding the lunar landings, they would be met with a deluge of information. A veritable tidal wave of web. Thousands upon thousands of meticulously crafted articles, videos, and forums present themselves, each claiming to offer definitive, well-researched proof that the official account is an elaborate fabrication. The sheer volume and intensity of this effort to dismantle a cornerstone of 20th century achievement is, in itself, a remarkable phenomenon. One might observe that an extraordinary amount of energy is expended to prove a negative. Yet, these are the contours of conspiratorial thought. In this landscape, authoritative sources like collaborative online encyclopedias strive to anchor the narrative, presenting the scientific consensus as the absolute truth. But for money, a fundamental question lingers, one that transcends technical analysis. The question of motive, the staggering expenditure, a torrent of billions of dollars poured into the Apollo program, seems disproportionate for a mission solely to collect geological samples. The reality, however, is that the lunar missions were never just about collecting rocks. They were the ultimate theater of the Cold War, a demonstration of technological and ideological supremacy on a cosmic stage. Every dollar spent was an investment in national prestige, a clear message to a global rival that the frontier of space had been conquered.